We're back. It's your Geordie Journos. There's only two this week for your regular Shots TV 10:30pm slot.
It's not 10:30 right now.
It isn't. I think you're
It's not live.
You're probably it's not an amazingly light night on Tyneside. But we thought we obviously have to record these things slightly in advance.
I know. Elliot Anderson.
yeah. So Elliot Anderson had disappeared by the time the video went out last time. But fingers crossed, you'll all be able to catch this on Freeview. Yeah?
Yes.
And also catch up as well if you need it. Right. This week's topic of conversation. What are we going for, Dom?
Eddie Howe. He's the man.
It's a shame we can't ask Jordan his opinions.
Yes, Jordan is in sunnier climes.
Sunnier climes. We all wish we were Jordan this week.
Yes. But yeah, it's sunny enough at the moment. But
It is,
yeah,
okay.
Eddie Howe, the main man.
And where are we? People might not know where we are.
Well, I think it's obvious. We'll be walking up these steps soon. A lot of you may be walking up these steps. This is the Delegate, the southeast, Strawberry Corner.
Strawberry Corner,
as it's
yeah.
better known. So in a few weeks' time, about a month's time, little over, we'll have the Cellar Weekender, and then the Premier League season starts on the 17th of August at home to Southampton.
Southampton on the first day. Quite reasonable.
It's a big test, isn't it, really? Because it's a bit like Forest a couple of years ago. The playoff winners, bit of an unknown quantity. There's a potential of certain players coming back as well. So we'll see what happens there.
I think it's a big first few weeks for Newcastle United. They need to get off on the right foot. They have done in recent years, so I expect they will. Home game, raucous St James's Park crowd. I'm sure everybody will bang up for that day, and fingers crossed. Well, there'll definitely be a fair few new signings, I would imagine, in the door by the time everybody gets back and is walking up some of these iconic stairs at St James's Park.
There's already been a few as well, which we'll get a closer look at in pre-season. So yeah, the big one, Eddie Howe, he's the main man. Last season was so up and down. If you follow us on YouTube, you were an Eddie Howe in, Eddie Howe, ooh, I'm not so sure. There was a range of emotions, and I think Newcastle fans will have felt it too. There was times where there were big question marks over Eddie Howe, but then I think towards the end he definitely regained some of that trust. That coming seventh, okay, Newcastle missed out on Europe, but it was a relatively strong end to the season. I'm firmly a believer in Eddie Howe, and I've got faith in Eddie Howe. I don't know how you're thinking after the season Newcastle have just had.
No, very much so as well. I think, and that's the main topic of conversation on this, is I'm very much Eddie Howe in, never been out. It's just, I think he's always had to grow and adapt. And I think that's the next part that's needed is has he learned some lessons from what in many ways, as you mentioned, was a roller coaster season. There were lots of minor ups and some quite big dips, I thought, during the season. How do you negate some of those dips, and how do you make them less dippy?
So this is Eddie Howe, if you're watching this is our take from we're not experts.
You're an expert.
I mean, I haven't got coaching badges or anything like that. So I think Eddie Howe, if he's watching, would take our advice to him with a huge pinch of salt. But this is what we think.
Yeah.
Eddie Howe could learn from last season, or could improve on this coming season.
Yeah, I think lessons have got to be learned. This is our little mini, we don't know how many points yet, but there's a definite point plan as to what we think Newcastle United need to do from now on in to improve.
Yes.
This is the Geordie Journos plan. As you expect, we do some waffling. So my first point, and I think it's the most obvious point that everybody else out there will be feeling too, is that injuries is the key, was the common denominator throughout the season, and we've already seen little flashes of injuries already. This not even in pre-season yet, and there's already flashes of injuries. Lewis Miley is going to be out for some time.
It's a big blow for him, isn't it?
A massive blow. It was a big season. It sounds to me like he's been trying too hard to come back, having missed the last few months of the season with a problem that he had. He's went and broken his foot, and it's going to keep him out for a little while.
They were playing it safe, weren't they, towards the back end? Because I remember speaking to Eddie Howe. He said he could probably play again this season, but it was just a case of get him rested up, get him ready for pre-season. Now he's going to miss all of it. Yeah,
they sent the lad on holiday, didn't they? They sent him away. I think he went to Dubai, and it was just like, go on, you relax up. 17, played a lot of games, now 18, ready to hit it fresh in the start of the season, and bad luck again.
Yeah.
When does bad luck go from being freak accidents to a common denominator, as I mentioned, and it's one thing that they have to learn from. I think the intensity of the way that Newcastle United play isn't conducive to keeping players fit consistently. Look, there's facets to this in many ways, but I think they have to learn lessons from that. To expect it just to cross your fingers and hope it'll be better by doing the same methods next season is fraught with danger, in my opinion. I think if they go about things the same way, with the same training methods, the same recovery methods, the same levels of intensity, yes, there's less games next season. That's going to be a big factor.
Yes.
But I think doing the same things, expecting different results in any walk of life, whether that be in the Geordie Journos world or whether that be Newcastle United at St James's Park where we are now, I think is really, really dangerous. So there was talk last season of being some kind of deep dive analysis into what has gone wrong. I think Eddie Howe at times last season admitted that he probably got things wrong.
He literally said as much on the record. He said there has been mistakes, but he didn't point fingers as such. He said it's a collective responsibility.
Yeah.
And I think Sven Botman's probably a prime example where some of it was to do with Eddie Howe, the medical team, Sven Botman himself. He's probably the prime example of a mismanaged injury from last season, and it's unfortunate that he obviously got that setback and will miss the large chunk of the first half of the season.
Quite iconic if you can hear that bird chirping away in the background. It's actually a magpie. Don't know what it's shouting at. The magpie shout? Tweet. Right, no, I think injuries for me is the real one that they've got to learn from. I hope he does. I think it's the one thing that undermined the whole season. I think without certain injuries, and it wasn't the freak ones that concerned me the most. It wasn't the Nick Pope getting injured and popping his shoulder out. It wasn't Dan Burn breaking his back or Elliot Anderson last season doing the same thing. It was Joe Linton being brought back too soon. Twice. It was, Dan Burn was brought back very soon from that broken back.
Fortunately, they got away with it.
And they were all right.
Got away with it. Dan Burn's form may have suffered slightly, but
yes, I think
he didn't
did.
suffer another injury on the back of it.
And Sven Botman, wherever that blame may lie, there was a lot of talk that it wasn't the club, it was the player himself who decided, I want to play on. Look, you're medical experts, take it out of the player's hands. If it's not right, get him sorted. And they paid a price for that. They're struggling now, and he's not going to be fit for the start of the season in a fresh season because of that management of that injury. He did his knee. He played against AC Milan in the first Champions League game and at Sheffield United in that 8-0 game.
I think.
Was it? Did he miss?
Brentford might have been the game, but AC Milan and Sheffield.
He played in those games with a damaged knee and played really well. He scored, didn't he?
Against Sheffield United.
Scored, but it's ultimately cost them because he wasn't the same player again.
Yeah.
He came back too soon, wasn't the same player, and looked a player who was. He was not the Sven Botman that we know. That's where it's got to change. The management of injuries, it's got to be better.
Yeah.
You can't legislate for a freak injury in a game. Nick Pope popping his shoulder, you can't legislate for that. It happens. Lewis Miley damaging himself on a
Jacob
run.
Murphy dislocating his shoulder and then playing him again 10 days later? Is that a freak injury or is that mismanagement?
But again, that was management of the injury. It was he was either fit to play or he wasn't, and he clearly wasn't. It was so precarious, that shoulder, that it popped out with the slightest bit running
after coming on.
It was 90 seconds after he'd come on. He went on a run and suddenly it popped. I think it was the slightest pressure from a defender. It went. So it's got to be that. It's got to be the identification of injuries, and it's got to be the management of them too.
Yes, and that's something that was picked up on. I've said this before on YouTube on our channel. Pep Guardiola, Jurgen Klopp said, the way Newcastle are managing their squad is almost ridiculous. It goes against the norm where they were playing well at the time in the Champions League and the Premier League, being competitive on all fronts with almost the same 11. And a Premier League's team teams in the Premier League these days, it takes 16 players to win a game. It takes you 5 substitutes. And Eddie Howe was using almost 11 players a Saturday, Wednesday, Saturday, Tuesday, Saturday or Sunday, whenever, and they were still getting results, and it almost defied anything Pep Guardiola, Jurgen Klopp, these elite managers had known about football. And one thing that stuck with me towards the back end of last season in the FA Cup after Man City knocked Newcastle out was Pep Guardiola saying Newcastle will learn lessons this season from being in Europe, playing those games and managing the squad. A player like Fabian Schär, who, to be honest, Pep Guardiola name-checked him, but he's a player who is very durable and plays most weeks. But he said he'll be a player now who was at the real top level. I thought he was good last season, but the season before he was one of the best defenders in the Premier League, playing Saturday, Sunday type thing. And getting back to that will be important. And what I would say is 2 seasons ago, Newcastle's injury record was actually very good. So Eddie Howe has to manage the injuries better, has to learn better. But there is a past example of Newcastle's injury record being fairly good.
I think they got away with it the season before, you know. I think it was
the back five not changing pretty much all season was the key to Newcastle's success in many ways.
I remember mentioning on social media that they got very lucky with injuries that year and being shot down by people saying, but Alan St Maximin missed X amount of games and Callum Wilson missed X amount of games and Alexander Isak missed it, and they did. That was fair. But to have a goalkeeper, right back, left back and 2 centre halves who played 95% of the games all season is almost unheard of in an area where injury is quite common. Defenders take knocks, they miss a game here or there. It didn't happen. They get suspensions for bookings and sendings off. Didn't happen really over the whole season. And that continuity, that trust that then was built up, produced one of the best backlines that the Premier League's seen in the modern era. They didn't concede goals at all. They didn't have that continuity last season, and it really made a big difference. So it's that management of injuries.
I think that's the first point. We'll wrap it up there for part 1. We'll see you in a bit after that break for part 2. Welcome back for part 2 of your Geordie Journos on Shots TV. We've been speaking about the lessons Eddie Howe could learn and what we think he could potentially do better for Newcastle United this coming season. Talked about injuries in part 1. Liam, what else? What do you want to talk about now?
So I think there's a few little minor things moving forward, and I think my first key point would be in-game management.
Yes.
Thoughts on that one?
No, I think there was a few occasions last season, as was spoke about in the first part, where Newcastle, it was almost so frustrating that Eddie Howe's hands were tied at times in terms of his bench. There was young lads on the bench, or there was your Paul Dummett's, Matt Ritchie's, who can't really change games in a positive manner. I think Matt Ritchie probably did that one time against Bournemouth. But there was probably games, I'll go back to Chelsea in the Carabao Cup quarter-final, when you've got a few knocks. Anthony Gordon was a dead man walking, couldn't run. And
I think Almiron in the same game, was he not? He couldn't run.
And that was the time where the injuries were cropping up, and you had Lewis Hall on the bench, who was eligible to play. You had young lads on the bench. He brings on Matt Ritchie, who again couldn't really run. And I think it saw Newcastle go on the back foot, and this is highlighting one game, but I think it happened a few times throughout the season where I think Eddie Howe's in-game management was called into question. There was one game in particular where it looked like Newcastle's season would pretty much be over, and this sort of maybe is an argument against the point we're trying to make, but Eddie Howe wasn't making the changes at the time, and the way Newcastle started the game against West Ham United here at St James's Park back in, it was end of March, there were 3-1 down, and then Eddie Howe did make a couple changes, but I don't know, do you think it was good fortune, or do you think that was good management from Eddie Howe? Because that's probably the one example, almost the exception to the rule, where Eddie Howe's made changes and they've worked wonders.
Yeah, so that the one in my head obviously is that West Ham game where it was remarkable that the comeback, and it was almost like a feather in the cap at the end of the game for him. It was like, your changes have massively impacted the outcome of this game. But I did feel they were forced upon him in the game. I think the changes that he initially made,
injuries, weren't they?
They were. The changes that he initially made weren't big changes to the game. It was almost then injuries that went on from that he was forced to bring on Harvey Barnes, who ended up having such a big impact, and other players. So that for me it's another one that sticks for me, is that I can count on one hand the amount of times that I think that Eddie Howe has actually made a big impact on a game. That was an outlier rather than the common thing. I think you said it off air. Come on, Eddie, we want you to be more West Ham and not PSG or Chelsea. And again, you mentioned his hands were tied, but we were both over there in Paris with Jordan, and I haven't got a lot of hair left, but I was pulling the rest of it out almost.
Yeah.
To think, like, please give those lads. Alexander Isak in that Paris game couldn't move.
Yeah, and it ties back to the injury management, doesn't it?
And
a little bit.
It is.
Because
it's all linked.
It's players dead on the feet having to get through 90 minutes.
Just at that time, I was just so desperate. It was like, just put somebody on and say, go on, son, have a run. Just go and chase that ball.
Yeah.
Just run on there like a dog chasing a ball. Just go and put pressure on people. You've got 5 minutes. He didn't. And I think he has to learn lessons from that. The Chelsea game down at Stamford Bridge, the changes weren't there. And Newcastle were just sucked further and further towards their own goal. We want to see positivity. Go and impact games in a positive manner off the bench.
It's what defines elite managers, isn't it?
Yeah.
Where Eddie Howe, might not like to admit it himself, is probably just in that band below elite.
Yeah.
And it's what defines elite managers. You saw Liverpool come here last season, down to 10 men, staring defeat in the face. Newcastle 1-0 up with 8 minutes of normal time left. Brings on Darwin Núñez, makes a couple changes. Eddie Howe takes Anthony Gordon off, who was Newcastle's best player, tearing Trent Alexander-Arnold apart, who was on a booking.
Yeah.
And Eddie Howe takes him off. Jurgen Klopp brings on players who ultimately change the course of the game.
I mean, look, you didn't have those options on the bench. It's not necessarily that. So I'll use Liverpool as the same example, and you go back to the Carabao Cup final, where Liverpool didn't have those high-profile options on the bench, and Jurgen Klopp still turned to his kids. He was throwing Dans on up front.
Yeah.
With a game still to win, Liverpool weren't in control of that game. Go and still win the game. He trusted his kids to go out there and do it. Look, I'm not going to, this is probably a different video altogether, that Newcastle don't have the levels and layers upon players that Liverpool have, or many of the other teams in the Premier League. But still, if they're good enough to be in the squad, you've got to trust them on the pitch. And when your players have nothing left, when they're firing, they've got nothing, they're running on empty, you can give us 5 minutes. You can give us 5 minutes. He did it at Bournemouth. He threw Ben Parkinson on and said, give us 5 minutes when the game was gone. He should have probably done that a little bit more in games. Look, he's not perfect. None of us are. This is a hypercritical video. We're critical friends. That's how I would describe
Constructive criticism for Eddie.
You're better with your words than me.
We'd appreciate, well, we might not always appreciate, but constructive criticism in the comments, we often get that.
We do.
And so on that, there was games last season, a lot of fans felt it, you felt it. I mean, there was question marks over Lewis Hall, for example, who's a player I know we're all excited about watching, first half of the season he did get a few run-outs and he did look a player a little bit off, but he's 19 years old. You have to trust him, and you think once Lewis Hall got a run of games, he looked great and he really developed, and maybe he needed that time to develop. But there were certainly games earlier in the season when Dan Burn was really struggling. Eddie Howe would rather play Dan Burn with a broken back than Lewis Hall, and I think that moves us on to our next point a little bit, where Eddie Howe just wants the feeling we get, and he may disagree with this. He wants control. He's a bit of a control freak, and that can work wonders for managers at times. But I think he needs to just relinquish some of that control and trust his players, trust his staff as well, which I'm sure he does to a degree. But then you've got Paul Mitchell coming in as a sporting director, and the sort of information we got regarding Dan Ashworth was never, in terms of a working relationship, it never really quite worked because of the way Eddie Howe wanted that full control. And I think it's something moving forward in terms of transfers, you just have to trust the people who are in there. And Eddie Howe is probably a bit old school in that way, where he wants full control. He is the manager of the club, but he's not. He's the head coach. He wants to focus on coaching the team.
He's not acting like a head coach.
No,
that's the top and bottom of it. Like we've all realised that. Anybody who's got any knowledge of work, the slightest workings at St James's Park knows that Eddie Howe wants control. I think we've mentioned it on these videos previously, whether it be on YouTube or on Shots TV, that Eddie Howe would probably prefer not to have those layers of football executives above him. He kind of just wants to run it like a Sir Alex Ferguson did, like a Sir Bobby Robson did, like Brian Clough, whoever it may be, like somebody like that. That's what they want. But it doesn't work like that. Football is a different business these days to what it used to be. The risk and reward is huge. If you get something wrong at this level, the amount of money that's involved, the amount of due diligence that has to be done on these players. It isn't. There is so much available to people that it's too much for one person to take on board. You almost need that collective approach rather than just one man making decisions. Nothing wrong with vetoes, nothing wrong with somebody having a big say, because ultimately it's got to fit in the team and the squad that you are producing. However, collecting all of that information has to be delegated, and that's one thing that Eddie Howe needs to do more, is delegate responsibility. And I think on transfers you've got somebody in now. Of course, anybody who missed the news, I'm sure you didn't out there, within the last week or so, Paul Mitchell, of course, coming in, one of the most highly regarded sporting directors on the planet at the moment, particularly involved with English football. Look, I'm not going to stand here and profess to be the expert on what a sporting director and director of football does. However, the people talking about what the jobs that Paul Mitchell's done in football, whether that be at Tottenham, back to MK Dons, Southampton, Leipzig, Monaco. He's got an amazing CV. He's got a CV where you'd say it's a big step up on Dan Ashworth, the man who went in previously to him. Trust the man who signed top players for all of these clubs. Interestingly, signed Kieran Trippier as well, didn't he?
Yes, for £3.5 million, and that turned out quite well.
Turned out all right here too.
Yes, which was an Eddie Howe signing.
It was.
A Kieran Trippier signing, really.
Well, it was a Kieran Trippier signing. Kieran Trippier approached Newcastle United, which I'm sure many of you guys who regularly watch the Geordie Journos will know.
Yes, so yeah, I think it's something Eddie Howe will grow. He's still fairly young in manager terms, and this is a new experience for him. Champions Leagues last season, the size of the club. Remember, he's come from Bournemouth, is pretty much the extent of his managerial experience, and what a job he did there. But it's a little bit different, and he recognises that, and he'll learn lessons. He's been here less than 3 years as well, so it's enough time to learn, and I think he has learned in some aspects. But I think the appointment of sporting directors, Newcastle are getting more and more coaches in, more and more scouts in. So Newcastle are starting to get more and more. They're growing, they're developing. They've developed quite a lot just since Eddie Howe's come in, and I think it goes back to your point. Eddie Howe has grown with the club to an extent, but that he has to keep growing.
Yeah, he does.
That's going to be so important for him. The likes of your Isaks, your Brunos, these quality players, Anthony Gordon to a degree, like all these elite players Newcastle want to attract, their aspirations as a club. Eddie Howe needs to be an elite head coach, not an elite all-encompassing manager. His job is to focus on making those changes on the pitch, managing the injuries to a degree, listening to his staff, and then the sort of overarching thing is trust the people around him. I'm not saying he doesn't, because he absolutely will to an extent, but with Paul Mitchell coming in, trust him. He's an expert in that field. Let him get on with his work.
Are you listening, Eddie? The Geordie Journos have spoken.
I'll see you in a couple of weeks, Eddie, so you can tell us how right or wrong I am.
And until next week, where you'll see the Geordie Journos again at your regular slot, 10:30 on Shots TV.
Thanks for watching.